talking about risk management, let's immediately do some deep dive. Because I called it experiences from risk management, and I do have some experiences, as Daniel already said, so with the long history in testing. And one of these experiences was that in one of the projects I was in the role of test manager, and I had to do a risk assessment as basis for risk-based testing. It was a mandatory process and policy to be followed, and one of the templates, the master test plan template, had this introduction text in it, where we should fill in the test risk matrix based on several analyses. And the word sounds familiar to most of you, maybe. But if you look at it, what do we mean with the test risk matrix? What is the matrix? Why a matrix? And several analysis, do we mean then several types of analysis? Or is it about several iterations of the analysis? A lot of questions. There was also, based on, as a starting point for that matrix, there was also a mandatory spreadsheet to be filled in. And that's pictures here. You can't read it, but that's not the issue. But in this Excel sheet, you had to fill in the requirements. And the requirements you had to assess for the risk. And actually, you had to assess them for what is the likelihood that there is something wrong and what is then the impact. And you had to do that for several factors. But a requirement, is that a risk? And why should we fill in the requirements? And if you have multiple factors to assess, is that then relevant for all types of these requirements? Because it's talking about marketing requirements and technical requirements. And it's just a bunch of questions. And I guess you might have been in the same situation. If you want to do risk management, how do you do it properly? So what is a good way to do risk management? This is about me, and this is just indeed saying that I do have some experience, so I hope that my experience can help you and find some ways to deal with risk management. I'm not going to show all these things in here, but I'm one of those in the lowest bar of what Tibor was showing yesterday, so the 3% of 55 plus. Forget it. A risk. I think we all know what a risk is. A risk is something that when it happens, it has a negative consequence. That's in essence a risk. You don't know if it happens, because if you would know, it's not a risk, it's just a fact of life you have to deal with. So a risk is something that can happen, and if it does, it has a negative consequence. So what we do actually with risk management is try to find in this whole chain of dominoes, to find the weakest tile or the most unstable tile, and to have a way to show how we can make that a more stable tile, so to prevent this whole chain of dominoes falling from being kicked over. That's what we want to achieve. And therefore, you want to test and you want to find what is this weakest tile. Going into this risk management, which is, of course, strongly related to risk-based testing, one of the pitfalls is that we start thinking from our testing perspective and our testing domain to find these risks or to deal with this risk management. And what I have learned over the years is that you should look outside of your own domain. And what I'm going to use today and what I'm going to show you, and which I hope is helpful for you, is one of the things that I learned from another domain, and that's something that has actually been mentioned by multiple speakers already in this conference, but without knowing it, it's the rule of three. And the rule of three is something which is very well known in the communications domain. And the rule of three, and I'm not going to dive into all the details of the rule of three, but the rule of three originally just stems from the old saying, all good things come in threes. And maybe without knowing, or maybe because they have done several courses, Marit was telling you yesterday, I have a whole list here, but I only picked 3. Do you remember? I think Christina did the same yesterday. This morning, Abby was showing a whole list. I only picked 3. Because that's how our brain works. Our brain works in threes. All good things come in threes. And this rule of 3 is something that can help you in risk management. And I'm going to show you. So I'm going to show you my experiences with risk management, where it went wrong, and also how this rule of 3 is going to help us to do it better. And the good thing is, if we look at risk management, what the risk management process itself is, it's already compliant with that rule of 3s. Because risk management in itself is a very simple 3-step process. You identify the risk, you assess the risk, and you deal with the risk. That's it. Just 3 simple steps. So let's look into those separate steps. So the risk identification. Risk identification is about getting the initial notice of a risk. So what is actually the risk that we need to deal with? Okay, what is actually the risk we need to deal with? From I-B, we know that we should call upon the broader set of stakeholders, so involve all kinds of people to find these risks. And maybe you had to look at my sheet with who am I? I have a lot of experience in very complex technical R&D environments, so that's why you see a lot of risk related to safety, but it's not the only type of risk, of course. But we try to identify these risks. And we all know it helps if you do that with multiple people, multiple stakeholders. Everybody involved in the project should help you in identifying the risk. However, what happens in reality is that we end up with these kind of things. Most of the projects I've seen is that you see again the spreadsheet I showed in the first picture of it, where we just mentioned the requirements that could have a risk for some reason. Or we come up with a list of things we call a test item or a risk item. And we list it and we say, okay, something like the accuracy of the application or the accuracy of the calculation could be of risk. It's nice that you say, but what is then the actual risk? What is then the problem? So all these things are just stating something that can have a risk without stating what the actual risk is. Some other projects I did, and especially in the technical domain you see that a lot, is we use different approaches, mostly elaborated approaches using these kind of spreadsheets, and they're all based on the more formal techniques like FMEAs. Anyone familiar with FMEAs? Failure mode effect analysis? Yes, okay, a couple of you. And so failure mode effect analysis is a more formal approach of identifying risks. And we create then these kind of spreadsheets, and we play around, I would say, with terms like effects and causes and risks and controls, but without knowing the actual way of dealing with failure mode and effect analysis. So the people who have to fill in these tables, these spreadsheets, don't actually know what to do. And it ends up mostly in a lot of details, all about the same risk. So we have 25 risks, and if you look at it, what's actually the risk, it's just all the same, but all kinds of variations with very small, little, tiny details being different. So this is also not helping. So how can we improve that? How can we identify the risk in a good way? And that's where the rule of 3 is going to help us. Because with the rule of 3, we're looking for 3 things. And there's just 3 things that are going to help us, and there's 3 concepts, 3 words, 3 techniques. And the 3 words, the 3 concepts, sorry, let's start with the 3 concepts, and that's coming from, indeed, from the failure mode and effect analysis. Look at effects, look at causes, look at controls. Really describe what the risk is. What is actually the effect? What is the thing that goes wrong, and what is its impact? And then think about, okay, describe what is causing that. What is the reason that this effect can appear? And the control is about, okay, what do we already have in place, or what can we put in place to prevent that from happening? Why is that important for testing? I hope to show you later in the presentation. But of course, you can think about, okay, if we do have a control, we check if the control is there. The 3 basic concepts that you need to know when you describe risk. But this is still abstract, so let's make it a bit more concrete. That's where the 3 words come in. And the 3 words we already know. This morning, Martijn had a presentation where he mentioned specification by example. And indeed, the given when then, which is often used in the combination with specification by example, is very known to us. And maybe we know it because of test automation from the Gherkin style, but we know the given when then, and we know how to describe the things that we want to have. But if we can describe by example the behavior that we want to have, we can also describe by example the behavior we don't want and the behavior we fear to happen. So we can reuse that concept of given when then also to describe our risks. And using it in combination with effects and causes, or with effects and controls, we can describe a risk into more detail based on an example. What is really the thing we don't want to happen? What is really the thing we fear to happen? And maybe you think, it's still a bit abstract. Still a bit complex. And then we use 3 techniques. Because as a tester, our toolbox is filled with techniques. And let's take 3 techniques, and I'll take state transition testing, control flow testing, and data combination testing. And it's just 3 examples of techniques you can use. But I choose deliberately those 3, because with states, you have the state of the system. With the control flow, you're talking about, okay, how is the application, how is the entire flow of your workflow? And with the data combination, you're talking about the data that you need to create that flow, or the data that comes out of that flow. So you have actually the broadest part of your application or your system under test with these 3 techniques. And if you combine it again with the given and then, you can make it even more elaborated in your risk description. And this is just examples. And of course, if you're more familiar with other test design techniques, you can use them as well. It takes a little bit of practice and playing around with it. But from the test design techniques and using it in combination with the given and then, and thinking from the perspective, okay, what is the thing I don't want to happen? What is the thing I fear to happen? You can try to describe your risks. So for the risk identification, using the rule of 3, we use 3 concepts, we use 3 words, and we use 3 techniques. And of course, the techniques, the ones I showed, are the ones that I like to use, but might not be the ones that you want to use. That's the first step. We identified the risk. So far, so good. And maybe this is the step that most of the time, we get into also with the old techniques or the old approaches where we just wrote the risk down. And even though, as I said, sometimes it's written as things which can have a risk and not as the real risk. And so this is helping you to write it more concrete, what is actual risk. But then going to the risk analysis. So risk analysis about assessing the risk, giving it a name and a number, you could say. Or put differently, risk assessment is about identifying the severity or the importance of the risk. And that's where I see even more struggles, because then it comes to thinking about, okay, what is the rating and what is the qualification of the risk? And we really have issues with dealing with that. And of course, what most is done is that we just look at what is the impact and what's the likelihood. So what is the likelihood the risk does become an actual event? And the impact, when it becomes an actual event, what is then the impact from it for the customer or the end user of the application or the system? But what you see when it comes to risk assessment and dealing with this impact and this likelihood is, again, we use all kinds of techniques, and they're not really helping us. And once more, I took a part of this spreadsheet, which is the best example of how things can go wrong. But first of all, we start with thinking about, okay, if we start to think about what is the impact or the likelihood of something, and what is then the factors that can influence that. So maybe we should assess multiple factors of it. And if there are multiple factors, then maybe we should think about, okay, are all factors equally important? If not, then maybe we should give them weight. And if you give them weight, you get very strange numbers. And at the end of the day, we come to a conclusion that we have to state something about the risk in its totality. And then it comes, actually there's just 2 ways left, and that you either multiply the impact with likelihood, and you did an assessment and you gave it a number, and say, okay, I gave a risk priority number, as we call it. And that we say, okay, we just multiply the assessment of the impact with the assessment of the likelihood, and it gives us a magic number, and the highest number is then the highest risk. Or we keep it separate, and that's often driven by, I should say, by the domain, where we like to have insights in what is the impact and what is the likelihood for this risk. You immediately see, of course, that if you just multiply it and you just give one number, that's the question it arises, which is the reason to use the graph view. Because if you have just a number, is it then the impact which is more adding to the risk, or is it the likelihood? And in some domains, the impact is of more importance than the likelihood. So why just use one number? And if we just multiply, and we get 18, because it's 3 times 6, no idea why you should have 3 times 6, but is it then because it's 3 times 6, or is it because it's 6 times 3? And is that different? Should we treat it different, that risk? And we try to assess these risks most of the time on ranges from 1 to 5, or even from 1 to 10. So if the impact of something with an 8 is that, how can you distinguish an impact of 8 with an impact of 9? Can you describe that? Can you see what the real difference is? No, you can't. The matrix is then something that you see, which is even having more questions. Because, what does it really mean? We have impacts and we have likelihoods with all kinds of strange magic numbers. And there is some area in the middle where we think, okay, how to deal with that? Because what we think is everything which is in the top right, that's high impact, high likelihood, that's a high risk. Okay, we can agree to that. Everything which is in the bottom left is a low risk because it's a low impact, low likelihood. But what about the other 2 parts of the graph? And what about that middle part where it's really close to each other? So you cannot just say it's high, medium, low. Hey, high, medium, low, isn't that how our brain works? Yes, that's how our brain works. And sometimes you have to deal with the domain, and you have to do an analysis of the risk of your product. And then you have these kind of nice risk graphs in your standard. This is actually coming from a standard. I forgot which one, but it is from a medical standard. And it's getting more questions again than answers. First of all, of course, why should you treat orange different from yellow? Huh? I already mentioned high, medium, low. Here we have 4 parts, but apparently 8 is bigger than 9, because they did this kind of assessment where they multiplied likelihood with impact. And 4 can even be a low risk, or it can be a medium risk. Who tells me? And the problem of if people are dealing with these kind of risk matrices in their domains, in the standards that they have to use for the domain, they also try to apply it on the risk assessment for all the different features in their development. But that's not how you should treat it. This is just a risk assessment of the product or the system as a whole, not of each and every feature. So forget about this one. Let's go back to the rule of 3s, see how it can help us. And again, I say there's 3 words, 3 different words. There's 3 levels and 3 techniques. And the 3 words is good, is, and enough. And it's just one sentence you can create with good, is, and enough, and that's good is good enough. Really do it like that. Good is good enough. Don't try to find the real difference between 18, 19, 20, or on an impact scale, on a likelihood scale between 1 and 10. You don't understand it. You cannot deal with that. Your brain doesn't work like that. So how can we do that better? And that's then immediately the next one is that I say use 3 levels. So good is good enough, and just use 3 levels. It's either high, it's medium, or it's low. Don't try to deal with all kinds of ranges or numbers. You won't understand it at the end of the day. It might sound logical at the moment that you're busy with it, but in 3 days, you really start arguing why you selected 7 instead of an 8. So just use 3 levels, high, medium, low. And if you have these 3 levels, be careful not to try to rate them within these levels, and that's why I put here an icon of just a list. What you saw in the matrix view, because it depends a bit on the domain and the type of application. Sometimes it's good enough to have just a list of high, medium, low. Sometimes there's a good reason to make a difference between impact and likelihood, and then use the matrix view still. There's the matrix from the beginning. But just list them. They are either in that area or they're not. It's not like it's close to the border of that area. No, it's not a position, it's just a list. You assessed it for the impact is high and the likelihood is high, so everything is high, so it's in that area. Just list them in there. And that gives you a very easy way of dealing with the risk assessment. And how to do that, which are the techniques? Well, of course, they're as simple as that. And one of them is just to use risk poker. Risk poker is very much the same as planning poker, but just using 3 cards with an H, an M, and an L. Or if you don't have risk poker cards, you just use 3 cards from your planning poker deck. Most likely the 1, the 3, and the 5. It's not about the numbers again, but 5 is then high, 3 is medium, and 1 is low. and just do, like you do planning poker, you do risk poker. And what is selected is the risk. So it's high, medium, low. Of course, sometimes you need to do that on the impact and likelihood separately. So then you do an impact and likelihood assessment, but actually it's the same. Or what you can do, and that's something I'll show you in a couple of slides, the lean risk wall of fame. So again, apply the rule of threes also on the assessment. So 3 words, good is good enough. We use 3 levels, just high, medium, low, nothing more, nothing less, and we use 3 techniques. But then we have to do something with the risk, again. Because nice that we know what the risk is and how important we think the risk is, but we also have to do something with the risk. So we have to evaluate or control. And from testing perspective, we always talk about risk mitigation. Formally, of course, there are 4 ways to deal with the risk. You can transfer it if it's outside of your control. Of course, that's the only reason you can transfer. You cannot just transfer because you don't like the risk. That would be a very strange reasoning. You can only transfer it if it's outside of your control. Then you can transfer it. If it's really something that you say, this is really a low risk, why should we bother? You might even ignore it. It's up to you. You can create contingency plans for when the effect becomes an actual event. How can you deal with the impact? Or you can mitigate by testing. Testing in all different ways, all kind of different levels, and see that in the end, that indeed the likelihood that the risk would occur is not as high as you initially assessed. So mitigation is actually a way to minimize the likelihood. And that's why it's a very good testing technique. Or put it the other way around, that's why testing is so important in risk management. But still, we have questions, of course, because assume there's a risk over there and we want to mitigate it. How are we going to do that? So what do we need to do for that? What steps do we need to take? But maybe even more important, what test to apply or what technique to apply for that risk? How can we decide on that? How can we make that decision? And when you start dealing with the risk, when you start mitigating the risk, you also start understanding that it could be interesting to show what you're doing and what the result is of what you have done. So you want to report on it. And then it becomes difficult again, because if this is the matrix as an example, what would you put then in the report? Is that just the numbers? How many risks are in a certain area still? Because you want to have the risk mitigated such that you only end up with the low-risk items. But if you just put numbers, that could be a risk on its own, because if one risk is after the assessment becomes higher and the other risk goes lower, the numbers just flip and you don't see any change. But you did something at the end. So that might be a problem that the numbers mask the risk flipping. And also, what do you really show? Is it enough just to show the current status? And like we have seen on different presentations as well, it's often more important to show how we get there. So you want to see something like a transition or a trend. I did some experiments with that. Try to visualize that, how risks really mitigate to time. In one of the projects we did it with waterfall graphs. And it was because we were working in an agile safe environment, so with program increments of 5 or 6 sprints, depending on the program increment. And with each sprint, we did a reassessment of the risk. And actually only a reassessment of the likelihood. And based on that, we created a new check on the risk priority number still. And that showed us if the risk is going down or going up. And some point in time, you see indeed that you do some testing and that you find some bugs and that you say, okay, actually the risk is higher than we expected. So that you see the risk going up again. And then you see it going down again. But it's a nice exercise. And it shows you indeed, over time, what you're doing with risk. Problem, of course, is you have to start with some of those magic numbers, with the risk priority number again, to be able to do so. But one of the other problems is that if you want to do this for a bunch of risks, how can you create this in a way that it's still manageable, that people still understand it with 25 or 30 of these graphs. That's not working. And in the end, is this an acceptable level overall? And so that's one of the things we ran into. So visualization of risk management is very difficult. So again, we're looking for ways to deal with that with the rule of threes. And the first thing is that we need to understand there's just 3 steps in the risk control part. And the 3 steps, of course, are test, identify, and reassess. You need to test, because that's the first action that you need to do to mitigate, to be able to do a reassessment. After you test it, you have to identify, did we identify any new risks in here? And we have to assess/reassess. So the new risk you have to assess, what is the risk of that new risk we identified, and for the ones that you were mitigating by the test, what is the assessment now after the test is done? But then you need, of course, to know how to test still, and therefore we use 3 mappings. And then we come back to where we started with the risk identification, because the mappings can be done based on the effects and the causes and the risk levels. Because the affected is something which is triggered by a state, a path, a create, read, update, or delete action from a database. So you can map effects to coverage items, test coverage items. We also looked at the causes, but the causes are where is the risk occurring? What does the risk make happening? And that is something which happens in a function, or in an application flow, or in an interaction. So that tells you something about on which level you should be able to test this. Is it something that you couldn't do already on component level testing? Is it an integration test? Should it be a system test? And we have this risk assessment with just high, medium, low. And for just high, medium, low, you can map test design techniques to test levels. And it's very unreadable, but this is just an example. You can create your own mapping, like, okay, in our environment, in our project, we know these test design techniques, and we can map them to the levels of high, medium, low. For example, if you're familiar with state transition testing, 1 switch or 2 switch, you can say this is a high test design technique. And for the medium, we just take state transition 0 switch, and we take error guessing exploratory testing, or just condition decision coverage as a low test design technique. I'm just making it up. It's your choice, but it's fairly easy to map different test design techniques based on the coverage item again. Then we have the effect in the coverage item again, on whether they are a thorough test or a less thorough test. And that's what it's all about in the end, because you want to have a very thorough test for a high-risk item and a less thorough test for a medium-risk item. And a not thorough test at all is good enough for a low-risk item. So you can create such a mapping yourself. So you can map the effects to the coverage items, the causes to the test level, so you know also when and where to test it. And you use your risk level, your identification of the level, as a mapping to the test design technique. So you have multiple test design techniques that could be applicable, and then with the effect, you can say, okay, what is then the best to select? So that's the test you do. And we need 3 visualizations. And the visualizations, of course, are where did we start, where are we now, and how did we get there? We want to have a trend or a transition in there, and that's why I put here the arrows between. The best is that you can show that indeed all in the same, that you really see that trend and not from the starting point to the current situation, and not just the trend as is. So again, for the risk control, using the rule of 3, 3 steps, 3 mappings, and 3 visualizations. And that is the use of the rule of 3 on the 3 parts of the risk management process. But how can you make that concrete in your organization, in your situation? And that's where I invented the lean wall of fame for risk management. And that starts again with identifying your risks. And you just write them on a sticky note, each and every risk on a separate sticky note. And I've just tried, but the wall is not really good for putting them on. But you just write every risk that you identified on a sticky note. And of course, remember, you use these 3 concepts, the cause, the effect, and the control, You use the 3 words, the given, when, then, the 3 test design techniques to think about what is the best way to describe my risk. Really describe the risk. Not something which could be a risk, no, the risk itself. You just write them down. You take one of them, doesn't matter which one, you take one of them and you put them on the middle of a whiteboard. And this really works if you have a whiteboard in a project area, something which is there always, which everyone can see at every moment in time. You just put them on there. The first one, you say, okay, this is our reference, we just start here. Doesn't matter where you put it, you just put it on somewhere in the middle. You take the next one, and the only thing you need to assess is it now a higher risk or a lower risk than that one? It can never be the same, it can only be higher or lower, because the risk is always relative. Something is more risky than something else, or less risky. It's never exactly the same. You always can make a choice, it's higher or lower. So you decide, is it higher or lower? Okay, maybe this one was higher, and you put it there. And you do the same for all the risks, one at a time. Maybe you have to reshuffle a bit, but in the end, you have this list of risks. And that's where the Wall of Fame idea came from, because you might recognize it a bit from the Wall of Fame from Top Gear with the lap times. They also keep shuffling, where does it fit in? That's exactly what you do with the risk. Is it higher, is it lower? No, okay, it fits here. So in the end, you have a list of risks. And then you start discussing. You do this with all your stakeholders, everyone who's involved in the risk identification. You point to the top one. You say, okay, is there any way that we can accept this? And I'm sure everybody will say, no, we cannot accept this. So you go down, you go lower, you go lower, you go lower, and lower. At some point in time, someone says, okay, yeah, this one, under certain conditions, circumstances, we could maybe accept it. So you draw a line. And you say, okay, everything above is unacceptable. You do the same, you start at the bottom. You say, okay, can we accept this one? And maybe you can accept the bottom one because it's really a low risk. And maybe it's one more you can accept. And at some point in time, I don't know, there will be one stakeholder who says, no, we cannot really accept this. Okay, put another line. Everything below is acceptable. And we have 3 areas. So we have our 3 levels of risks. We have the high level, the high area, where we say this is really unacceptable. We have the low area, which we say this is acceptable. And we have something in the middle, we say it's medium. That's to be discussed. And then we start with our risk control. So we just take one. And we visualize it, that we're doing something. We shift it in time. So we put an arrow in there, it's time. We say we're testing. It's still the same risk level, because it doesn't change the level, because we're still doing something, but at least you notify to your stakeholders that you're testing, that you're dealing with it. You might put a ghost note there to indicate where it came from, where it started, at which level. That's why it's a light yellow one there. You start testing. And the next step was identify, is there any new risk, and reassess. We did not identify any new risks for this one, but we did reassess. And we identified after the reassessment, after all the testing we did, that if we would reassess it now, it would end up at that position. So we put it there, but we put it there in time. So we do not put it again in the wall, no, we put it in time where it is now. At the same time, we already started testing another one. And we do that, of course, with the 3 mappings. Then we say, okay, what is the effect? So how can we map that to a coverage item? How can we map the causes to a risk, to a test level? How can we map the level to test design techniques, to select the right test, of course, to execute? But we test, we re-identify. And the second one, we did identify the new risk. We assessed it, and it was even higher, so we put it over there. And we just continue with this whole story till at least everything is below that top line. Because then everything which is unacceptable at all levels is at least in a level where we can have a discussion. And then it's up to you how to continue with the same approach. And to make sure that maybe you would have everything under the bottom line. That you say, okay, we can accept everything. But the middle part is always discussion, of course, about budget, time, that kind of thing. So yeah. The top line is the most important one. Get everything underneath there. And you see that we have not only used the 3 steps of testing, identification, reassessment, and the 3 mappings, but also the 3 visualizations, because you see exactly in time where did we start, what are we doing now, what is the trend, what is our transition, and what is the current situation, where are our risks at this moment. Are we good enough, yes or no? So to summarize, the risk management process in itself is just a very simple three-step process. You identify a risk, you assess a risk, and you deal with the risk. And you can do that in a very lean way with the lean risk wall of fame. I think I went far too fast even.
Yeah, you were really fast.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. All in all, so please use the Event app to ask some questions. I already have two, but we have time for questions now. First of all, thanks for your presentation. We really like that. I like this lean risk wall of concept. Maybe I will utilize in my project. First question. How much time should be allocated for risk management, and how often must this be done?
Yeah, the time question is, of course, and at one hand, it's a difficult question because it really depends about I think the domain and the type of project and the life cycle model you're using. I would say if it's in an agile process, it should just be part of either your sprint planning or your refinement sessions that you allocate approximately maximum half of that time also for the risk. But if it's in the refinement sessions, let's say you first identify the risk, and you can use a second session to do the assessment with just the risk poker, which is very fast, of course. So that's a bit of the time. If it's more if you have a sequential life cycle model, if you're more in a regulated environment, where it's just still fairly normal to have sequential life cycle models, I think the initial risk assessment is a brainstorm that will take sessions like a 2-hour session, something like that, to have the first identification of which are the risks, and maybe take half an hour just a bit later to let it sink in, half an hour later to do this first mapping on the wall. Okay, how do we prioritize the risks? But after that, it's just a matter of minutes to deal with the risk. That was about the time. The second question, the second part was?
Yeah, how often shall you done it?
Yeah, so how often should you do it? So actually, it's a continuous process. Of course, that's the easy answer. And I think in agile environments, you can easily map that to your agile events, like a recheck with the planning sessions, with the refinement session. Do we have to do anything with the risk? Is there any change in there? That will be very normal moments in time to deal with that. And again, in sequential projects, it's just depending on how much time it takes for a certain test or an execution run to complete before you do the next assessment and identification.
Okay, it's my question now. So do you have any tool what you utilize for risk management, or you are just using Excel? Lots of people are using Excel for risk management. We do it actually at my company.
Yeah, well, so if you use the lean wall of fame, you don't need any tool at all in the end, because you write everything on sticky notes. The only thing with sticky notes is after a couple of weeks, they tend to fall down from the wall, so you might renew them every time. But of course, you can make it a whiteboard in a digital whiteboard or a Miro board or whatever. That's also fine. I have been using the Prisma tool in the past. That's the one from which the matrix view was coming. Prisma was a tool which is based on I think on an article from Erik van Veenendaal, so the project risk management approach. The Prisma tool had the drawback that there was a lot of discussion, as I showed, on the numbers and the factors and that kind of things. But the rest is all spreadsheets. Also for the FMEAs, it's all spreadsheet based. Yeah.
Okay, another question. Who has the final decision related to which risk will be addressed first?
Depends. You should always start with the risk which is in the area of the things that you identify as high risk item. And the one which you address first depends on a couple of things, of course. First of all, if based on the assessment, which is the test level where we could mitigate this risk, are we already able to mitigate it at this moment in time? So that's a thing where it's not somebody who decides, but it's more the situation that defines it for you. I think in the end, Yeah, it depends a bit on the roles, but it's a tester or a QA engineer or a quality manager who should decide, okay, this is the one which we think is the most important one, but it also depends on the type of risk. Is it really a risk related to customer acceptance? Maybe it might even be a product manager or product owner who says, okay, please look at this risk first. So it's also a bit of a collaboration with all the stakeholders involved in the risk assessment.
Okay, any other question from the crowd, guys? We are finished with the questions, but actually if we are finished, then you are here until the end of the conference.
I'm here, yeah.
And you can answer, you can just grab André and he will talk about risk management for hours. Yeah. I'm sure about that. So thanks a lot for you, for being here with us in Budapest. I hope we will see you next year too. Another round of applause to André, please.
Welcome, thank you.